The city of Chicago, being the first largest city of its kind to independently get rid of the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. That's the wage that workers that work at restaurants where you tip the server. It's sit-down service. They come and take your order. They tell you what the special is. They bring your food out from the window. They then help get your refills and so on. Well, in Chicago, they're phasing out that tipped wage, which is lower than the minimum wage. But I don't think people necessarily understand restaurants are meant to make up the wage if they don't make enough tips. So if you're a server and you go in and you have a ton of tables and you're making a ton of tips, then you get paid by the restaurant sub-minimum wage. It's not the minimum wage, it's a sub-minimum wage, because likely if you have a lot of business, you're going to be making well over the minimum wage with those tips. Now, there are some times where it's just not busy, and the restaurant, for whatever reason, be it it's too nice outside, or be it, there's a convention across town that's taking all of the business, whatever the case may be, sometimes a server doesn't make the minimum wage with the amount of tips they get for their hours that they worked. So a restaurant, by law, is to make up that amount of difference between the tipped wage and the minimum wage if the server cannot claim tips that are more and above and beyond the actual minimum wage. So there's already that in law. It's a state law. It happens in every state. And it's something that the Department of Labor has to deal with if there are complaints. So there's still that law. But that aside, Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson holding a news conference on Friday announcing that indeed Chicago is becoming the largest U.S. city to independently abolish the sub-minimum wage. Here is Johnson spelling out why he thinks that this is all part of bringing about what they call one fair wage. And I want to ask you at 217-629-7970 your thoughts on this. Is this going to essentially bring down the expectations of good service when it comes to what you get at a sit-down restaurant?
Today is an historic day for the city of Chicago as we've passed the One Fair Wage Ordinance. This legislation is the culmination of years of advocacy and outreach by the One Fair Wage Coalition, restaurant workers, and advocates. The ordinance embodies Chicago's values of uplifting working people and addressing systemic inequities in the restaurant and hospitality industry, which in turn will create a better economic future for tip workers and our city. Over the next 5 years, the wages of tip workers such as servers, bartenders, bussers, and runners will increase 8% per year until it reaches parity with Chicago's standard hourly minimum wage of $15.80 per hour. Yes! By increasing wages, we can address the restaurant industry's staffing crisis, increase opportunities for youth employment, and create a safer and more welcoming working environment. We can also uplift communities and the Black and brown women and workers who make up much of this workforce, and many of the people who are standing in support with us today. These are heads of households and anchors of communities who are finally receiving a bit more of the respect and dignity that they deserve. In addition to this legislation, One Fair Wage, a national nonprofit organization, has committed to providing capacity building grants to small, women and minority-owned businesses to support this transition and restaurants that may be impacted. One Fair Wage also will continue to participate with restaurants in training and grants to help them build the infrastructure that's needed to manage this incredible historic day.
So again, having what he calls one fair wage. And I'd love to hear your thoughts at 217-629-7970. Again, 217-629-7970. Do you think this is going to increase the level of service you get? Or is it going to decrease expectations of the types of service that you get. Now, Michael Saltzman, he's executive director of the Employment Policies Institute, and he says that this is just not going to work out as the supporters believe that it will work out.
The mayor's got no idea what he's talking about. The only thing that's going to happen here is it's going to drive servers outside of the city because they're going to find themselves earning less than they did before.
So that's a question. Are you going to tip if you know that these servers are making the minimum wage? And Saltzman goes on to say that around the country, restaurant owners and restaurant workers have pushed back against this idea.
First and foremost, because it's bad for the workers. Tipped workers around the country have rallied against this kind of policy because what it means is fewer job opportunities and less income.
So let's get your thoughts at 217-629-7970. Good morning. You're on WMAY.
Hey, Bishop. So he's going to fix a problem that isn't a problem.
Well, he's addressing a problem. Wage. He's addressing a problem that groups of people who want to unionize restaurant workers to essentially bring them all to the same level. This idea of what he calls one fair wage. I don't think
it'll affect the service you give, but I do think what will happen, prices will go up in restaurants, and because of that, people will tip less. So they'll probably end up making less money.
Yeah, and that's what some of the opponents to this idea from the Employment Policy Institute says. The servers are likely to make less money. So you'll still tip on top, just not as much? Is that a question for you? 217-629-7970. I want to hear from you. You going to tip on top of this server class getting the minimum wage eventually after 8 years? And what about the restaurant owners? How are they going to be impacted by this? As the caller intimated, could mean increased prices. Listen, I worked as a server for years. I worked as a bartender for years and made good money doing it. Now, obviously, it's hard work. It's not something that everybody could do. But if you're good at it, then you made good money. It was merit-based. But will having, quote, one fair wage take away that merit? Good morning. You're on WMAY. Your thoughts on Chicago being the largest city to phase out the tipped wage? Good morning.
Personally, I think it's an experiment, honestly, but I think it's rooted in good intentions. I think that the people that are going to tip regardless, and it's not going to affect that because I don't even think of the server when I'm at a restaurant and tipping. I think of the wait staff, So I don't think it's going to have the huge negative impact that restaurant owners think it'll have or things like that. But it'll be an interesting experiment to find out. If they're already making minimum wage, even if they don't get tips, they know how to budget for that. And I think the complaint from like a wait staff or a server is going to be they don't have the extra little bit of money every day. And I've known people who were waiters and servers and everything else for a while, and they like that extra money, but it does make it difficult to budget. So I think the net effect, we'll have to wait and see, but I don't think it's going to be the doom and gloom that a lot of other people think.
So you're willing to upend the system as it is now? Seems to work just to experiment.
Well, does the system really work, though? Because you said that we have to employ government to check on that wage theft that would occur if they're not getting compensated by the restaurant. So is it really working? And if it were working well, would this even be a thing?
Well, is what working? The enforcement of that, the checks that the Department of Labor has to make. I got to check the statistics on that, but I would imagine. I mean, if it's the law, they got to be enforcing the law.
Yeah, but we have major organizations like Walmart that will employ people and pay them sub-minimum until they're caught. So we are spending government resources, we are spending tax money to enforce something that you may think that a business owner honestly would do that, but I've known plenty of business owners that honestly would not if they knew they could get away with it. and how many complaints you need. How long does it take for government to get involved for them just to pay back what they should have been paying for?
And I think the Restaurant Association has said, the Illinois Restaurant Association has pushed back against this idea of one fair wage, saying, well, why don't you just increase enforcement? Give the department what they need to go out there and actually enforce this instead of requiring lower expectations for service and increased costs for restaurants, which is going to push the bottom line onto consumers.
Well, so what the Restaurant Association is saying is that taxpayers should foot the bill for them to do what they're supposed to do. So they are moving that burden to everybody when, as a business owner, they're the ones that should be doing that anyway.
Well, listen, I don't think the Restaurant Association is advocating for business owners to not follow the law. That's not what they're saying.
No.
They're saying
but they're advocating for
the law, if the law is going to be in place, then enforcement of the law has to be swift and done thoroughly. And if that's not being done thoroughly, then that needs to be addressed instead of increasing the wages. I'm just saying, that's at least the perspective I've heard from the Restaurant Association.
And that's awesome. And I believe that from the Restaurant Association when they start filling out I-9s and make sure they're not hiring people that shouldn't be hired.
Well, again, the Restaurant Association is going to have their position on this. Will this be a statewide policy? We'll see. Of course, as you mentioned, it's kind of an experiment, so we'll see how it plays out over the next few years in Chicago. But would you say that you'd want to see this implemented statewide?
I would like to see it a little further, and I would like for us to go to a system where tips aren't even expected, and workers that work for a restaurant or any other business that is successful make a living wage. That's what I'd like to see.
Well, have you ever worked in the service field as a server?
Not as a server. I've worked in like fast food, but I've never worked as a server. So I don't have that perspective. I have friends that I've known for 30, 40 years who have, but not myself personally.
I tell you, knowing servers, having worked in the service industry as a server, as someone who trains servers, there are people who make good money based on the merit of being an awesome server. And I think that they would probably be a little irate if they were kept at one fair wage, as the supporters of this policy up in Chicago call it, because they might just say, you know what, I'm done. I'm not gonna be put in the same level as that subpar server just out of fairness.
Well, they're not, because they still can make tips on top of it.
But really, are you going to be doing that? If you know that the server's making $20 an hour, are you really going to be tipping on top of that?
If I can't afford the tip, I can't afford to eat there. So, yes, I will be tipping. It'll be 20% every time.
Right on.
I've not made tips on service ever. So.
Gotcha. I appreciate the call. Take another one. He had good points, good debate. Appreciate that. That's what we're doing here with Springfield's Morning News. One last call before the break. Good morning.
Good morning.
Go ahead.
Yes, I have a suggestion about solving this concern about the tips and getting a valid wage for waitresses and waiters. At the end of a shift, they clock in their tips. If they don't meet minimum wage for bring home pay that day, then the restaurant picks up that portion. Otherwise, they keep all their tips.
So you're essentially kind of giving a little bit of a different approach than what it is right now statewide, where the restaurant has to make up the wage up to the minimum wage if they don't make those tips. But you're saying if they make more in tips than the minimum wage with this one fair wage, then the excess tips goes back to the restaurant?
Nope, goes back to the waitress or the waiter. So minimally,
but that's how it is right now. But that's how it is right now. They keep the cash and all the credit card tips they get. It doesn't go back to the restaurant.
But are they getting a minimum wage? Are they getting minimum wage while they're working?
No, they're getting the tipped wage, but they're making well over the minimum wage when they get those tips.
Right. What I'm suggesting is that no matter what, that waitress or waiter comes home with the minimum wage. If they don't make enough tips, if business isn't good that day, the restaurant picks up the cost of that.
Oh, so you're talking daily. You're talking daily.
Daily.
Okay, because as it is right now, it's every pay cycle they make
That's
that
right.
up.
So if I go in on a shift and I don't make minimum wage that day, the restaurant has to make sure that I go home
and that takes a little bit more bookkeeping and something I guess could be done whenever they have to rectify the drawers at the end of the night. You kind of know that process if you worked in a restaurant. Appreciate the calls. Got to take a break though. It is Springfield's Morning.